right. So happy Thursday or Tuesday. I wish it was Thursday, right? I guess I'm thinking ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all. This week we are looking at tragedies. And specifically, we're looking at Shakespearean tragedy. And it kind of follows a set formula. Most tragedies do. Last week we talked a little bit about different character types, and we're going to kind of address that this week as well. Shakespeare is an interesting dude. He is hard to understand a lot of the time. If you've ever read Shakespeare in class, sometimes it's difficult to get to the point of what they are saying. If you look at it in modern terms, though, it's a story that is still relevant and interesting today. Lots of movies have been made after Shakespeare, and some of them don't even feel Shakespearean. There is a movie called 10 Things I Hate About You. Fantastic movie. It's based on a Shakespeare play. A lot of them are. So we'll jump in. And this should look familiar. This was from the lesson this week. It says, "Isn't it tragic?" So this whole lesson is about tragedy. Literature is a mirror that reflects our truths, even in our darkest moments. So a mirror, y'all know, like when you're on Instagram or Snapchat, there are all of these filters, right? I like the one that makes you look like Kim Kardashian. I've tried that one a few times. It's definitely not what I normally look like. Literature is not like that. Literature is unfiltered. It is like having a mirror through which you see everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. The honesty of unhappy endings mimic the disappointments and tragedies in life. A lot of times we like to have that happy ending, right? Where, the guy gets the girl, or the girl gets the guy, or they win the lottery, or they, strike it rich, or their business is successful. We like seeing those happy endings. Oh, I'm gonna let Anna Maria in. So, but in real life, we don't always get those happy endings, right? I mean, there is a lot of disappointment, there is a lot of tragedy. So, when we put these moments on the page and when we actually write them out, the writers remind us of the experiences that are true to life, right? Like tragedy is just a part of living. So, even if our experiences are not the same as the protagonist of the story, we can learn and grow from their mistakes. My dad used to always say that a wise person or a smart person learns from their mistakes. A wise person learns from the mistakes of others. And so that's kind of what we're looking at in doing something like this. So Shakespearean tragedy is definitely not original, right? It's something borrowed. So it's pretty common knowledge that Shakespeare's status as a genius is well deserved. He wrote over 150 poems and 37 plays. Even though it's been about 400 years since Shakespeare died, which weird story, he died on his birthday. That's kind of interesting. His works are still considered a significant part of literary canon, but surprise, the majority of Shakespeare's ideas were not his own. He collected topics from history, mythology, other writers, and then he kind of rewrote them in his own style. So there's an activity we're going to look at on the next page to see some of the inspiration. And when we use the word canon, like it's part of a literary canon, that just means a collection of historically important works. So even when you talk about shows, they'll say like, oh, and this show's canon, and it just kind of means like the entirety of that. Whoops, going the wrong way. Okay, so just as a warm up, when we talk about Hamlet, which is a play that was written by Shakespeare, so his legendary tragedy, it's about a philosophical prince. He's the, holding the skull, to be or not to be. His uncle kills his dad, who happens to be the king, and then marries Hamlet's mother, who is the queen. So this is weird, right? So it'd be like having your uncle kill your dad and then marry your mom. Bizarre. So Hamlet just becomes obsessed. He wants to take back the throne. He feels like it was wrongfully taken from his dad. So while Shakespeare's To Be or Not to Be is original, that story is not. So it's the story of Amleth, which is a Scandinavian myth, dates back to the year 1200. Amleth, which is a word that translates back to stupid, he pretends to be mentally unstable to avoid his uncle being so angry, and then he plots an assassination of his uncle. If you move the H from the end of Amleth to the front, you've got Hamlet. So Hamlet wasn't even a super creative title. He just rearranged the letters in the original story. Bravo. So another one, Romeo and Juliet. We've heard this story multiple times. So they had these star-crossed lovers in a Babylonian myth. Their parents were like, no, you guys cannot love each other. Our families are so different. They planned an escape through a wall that separated their houses. So the poet Ovid retold this story in the year 8, which was a long time ago. It was told again under Geoffrey Chaucer. You guys will study Chaucer, especially in college. He wrote like the Canterbury Tales. He wrote about it in the poem The Legend of Good Women. The Montagues and the Capulets, those are the two families from Romeo and Juliet. They were not Shakespeare's creation either. So Dante, the guy that wrote Dante's Inferno, his 14th century Divine Comedy, which Dante's Inferno is part of, it mentions the feuding families and warned what would happen to Italy if they did not make peace. So Shakespeare said, "What's in a name?" But then, he kind of made this play his own, and it's lived on for a really long time. Romeo and Juliet's one of the most remade plays and movies in all of history. So when we look at who Shakespeare was as a person, he's often regarded as one of the greatest playwrights and poets. Oddly enough, being a poet was more prestigious than being a playwright. And so even though we mostly know him because of his plays, he wanted to be known more as a poet. So over his lifetime, he wrote approximately 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and he wrote 2 long narrative poems. And then just looking at the context of the day, so like what was going on around the world during this time, he also drew inspiration from just the stuff that was going on around him. So when he wrote Julius Caesar, Queen Elizabeth was the Queen of England. She didn't have any children. There was a bit of uncertainty over who was going to become the king because, again, we were in a very patriarchal society at this point. So it would have been unheard of for a woman to become queen without being married to a king. And during this time, just as far as history goes, this is when like Jamestown Colony was being established. They actually named the state of Virginia is named after Queen Elizabeth because she never married. She was known as the Virgin Queen. And so the state of Virginia is named after her. So she served just because she was the queen. She was the basis for a whole lot of writing during this time period. So when we look at what is a Shakespearean tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy is just literally a play that was written by Shakespeare. It tells the story of the protagonist, that main character who has a great fall, or at least he goes downward, he may not hit rock bottom. And it's due to this combination of both personal flaws and external forces. So these types of plays are marked by a pretty serious tone. I think that's why people think Shakespeare is a little dry because it does tend to be serious. But then it also explores things like fate or ambition, the human condition in general. We'll see these certain trademarks that you will see occur in any kind of tragedy, where it's external forces, revenge, good versus evil, the supernatural, and the tragic hero. So we'll look at that just a little bit. And this is from this actually was in the lesson this week where it talked about Julius Caesar. So this should look really familiar. Julius Caesar, he was the emperor of Rome, so he was the guy in charge. He is literally stabbed in the back. You guys have heard that expression, right? Like, I had a friend that stabbed me in the back. Well, this is where that expression comes from. So Caesar's best friend and colleague was this guy named Brutus, and he literally stabs him in the back and murders him because he thinks that that is what's best for his country. So Brutus is kind of that tragic hero in the story of Julius Caesar. He listens to all of these people around him instead of listening to what's on his inside and his heart and mind. And so he conspires with his friends and colleagues and ends up murdering his friend Caesar because he thinks that that's what's best for the country. But he was wrong. And then after Caesar dies, this entire civil war breaks out, dividing the country. So in this story, the external forces, it's peer pressure, and it's 2024. Peer pressure is still a thing. But even back then, peer pressure made its presence known in the world of Shakespeare. And sometimes those people who are around us have an even bigger voice than we have ourselves. I don't know about you guys, but when I was a teenager, I definitely did some things that I knew that I should not do because of a friend's influence, right? And so just as predicted, going against our better judgment, if there's that voice in your head that says, hey, I should not be doing this, you should probably listen to it. same way that Brutus, has these dire and tragic consequences. So again, back to that example from Julius Caesar, Brutus, the protagonist and the tragic hero, he allows Cassius to kind of get in his head a little bit. He starts thinking that it would be best for his country if Caesar is assassinated. And so there's this conflict between those external forces versus that voice in your head. And then at that point, it's like, who's to blame? Was Brutus entirely to blame? Was Cassius, and his buddies, were they to blame? And we see that even now. If you guys follow, do y'all listen to true crime at all? I love watching stuff about like the Manson case and just like that kind of thing. And like with Manson, he didn't actually kill anyone. He's not Brutus. He would be Cassius. So he's got this influence over all of these people, and they just go and do whatever he tells them to do. And so these people wind up dead and they all end up in prison. And it's kind of the same sort of deal. Like these people like Brutus end up listening to their friends, and it just completely goes downhill from there. Revenge is also a huge deal when we see tragedies. But most writers are not as good as Shakespeare in this. Revenge is at the very center of these tragedies. So this idea of like, I have to get even. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm a big fan of like karma and what comes around goes around, and like seeing the bad guy have bad things happen, right? And so this idea of getting even and having revenge is huge through all of Shakespeare's works, and really through most of the things that we see in history. So Caesar has this friend, just, again, back to this example from Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to avenge his death. Like, so he gets this crowd all riled up, and this is inevitably what causes this civil war. So good versus evil, that's another one. And so you guys have probably heard this quote. I included it in the slide, but character is what you do when you think no one is looking. So someone drops their wallet. Nobody sees. Do you pick the wallet up and return it to the guy? Do you take the money out of it? You're grocery shopping. Do you put your buggy back where the buggies go? Do you leave it out in the parking lot to hit someone's car? So when it looks like no one would catch you, do you do the right thing or you do the wrong thing? Right? So it's a good versus evil, like the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. So everybody has these flaws and imperfections, and sometimes those get the best of us, right? I mean, there are times where we don't do the right thing. So we've got our own like moral decisions of right versus wrong. But then there are also those times that we face right versus wrong as an external force. So back to our example with Julius Caesar, Brutus, right? He's the one that kills Caesar. So he struggles with this decision. Like he's killed his friend. Now supposedly it's going to be for the good of Rome. But then he's got to decide, like, how much does what Cassius, how much does that matter? Like his words. And when you think about your best friends and the people who are in your ears, the ones that you listen to for advice, how much stake can we put into that? The supernatural is also a big theme throughout these tragedies, especially with Shakespeare. But if you've ever had that feeling where something's just not quite right, like maybe, you're about to go somewhere and maybe I need to stop and get some water or whatever. And then you find out there's been a terrible auto accident, or a friend invites you to a party and you find out that the cops were there or someone got hurt. And it's just that feeling that's like, maybe I steer clear of this situation. And you may not even know why you're making that decision, but something just doesn't feel right. Shakespeare makes a really good use of that feeling. There's a lot of times where we will see like a prophecy or bad weather. Like if your friend says, hey, we should go to this party, and all of a sudden thunder starts clapping and lightning comes out of the sky, you're going to look at that and say, whoa, maybe that's a sign, right? And so they kind of use this to signal like something isn't right. Make sure you're paying attention to this. So Shakespeare does that in Julius Caesar. There is a soothsayer, which is kind of like this fortune teller that's there to point out what the truth is. Like their job is literally to just speak the truth. There are strange things that happen with the weather in the streets of Rome. Brutus and Caesar have their fair share of warnings that things are going to be bad, but obviously no one pays attention to that or we wouldn't have a story. So these warning signs are ignored. So the tragic hero is one that we're going to see obviously in every tragedy, but that's what makes things the most tragic. These people never see it coming. Like at some points, you can kind of see with the foreshadowing what's going to happen. Our main character, our protagonist, sees none of that foreshadowing. So Shakespeare was this tragic artist, and he creates these tragic downfalls with these main characters. So the protagonist is always problematic. There is never a protagonist that is just some nice, normal guy who always does the right thing. But they do still have that sense of good in them. Like you find yourself rooting for this person. And so you kind of want the best for them, but then at the same time, you're like, man, I hope that that never happens to me because that would be terrible. Julius Caesar is a really good example of this. So Shakespeare illustrates this protagonist that kind of seems like the bad guy, but we still feel sorry for him, right? Like he's good on the inside, but he lets these voices around him and in his head get the best of him, but we still find ourselves feeling sorry for him. So Shakespeare's tragic heroes, like they're tragic because these things could have been prevented, right? If you've seen the downfall of a celebrity or a downfall of a friend or family member, like it's like, wow, that really could have been prevented if they had just chosen differently, if they had paid attention to some of these signs. Aristotle, this whole idea of tragedy is not new. Even in ancient Greece, they were big fans of drama. We're still fans of drama in 2024. That's why shows like The Real Housewives or The Kardashians are still popular. Their versions of plays were very different from what we see now. They served more to teach instead of to entertain. And y'all know, like when y'all are in class and a teacher shows a video, you can tell, is that video supposed to entertain me or am I supposed to be learning a life lesson, right? When they're a little bit corny, it's obviously this is meant to teach a lesson. So there were four different aspects of an Aristotle tragedy. The first one is hamartia, and it's the tragic hero, tragic flaw. There are poor decisions leading to this downfall. Peripeteia is the next one. And I know these words are kind of hard to pronounce. Peripeteia. This is a sudden or unexpected reversal of fortune or a change in circumstances. Ananorisis, that's when the tragic hero discovers that they're the reason for their own downfall. It's like I have no one else to blame but myself. And then catharsis, or that kind of end of the line, this is the audience's reaction. We kind of end up feeling sorry for this protagonist. It results in the realization that hopefully the hero's downfall is an important lesson to be learned. Tragic heroes have it all, right? They've got money, they've got fame, they've got friends. They're not necessarily your regular protagonist who just has this tragedy that is outside of anyone's control. Tragic heroes, they're the only ones to blame for their tragic ends because other people can see it, but they don't necessarily see that tragic flaw themselves. You can usually, as a reader, when you're reading these things, sort of pick up on some of these internal weaknesses. And a lot of times, these are the weaknesses that are involved. And again, this is straight from the text that y'all are reading in Educator this week. But pride, excessive pride, they call that hubris. This was what it was called by Aristotle. It's that tragic flaw. Examples in The Tortoise and the Hare. You guys have seen or read The Tortoise and the Hare, right? It's the rabbit and the turtle that are having the race. And the rabbit is just like, dude, why am I even trying? And he stops to take a nap. And that ends up letting the tortoise win the race. So this is a case of pride, right? His hubris is what says, hey, I can stop and just take a nap. If you guys have seen, there's a baseball video and this kid strikes out, but the catcher drops the ball. And so if the catcher drops the ball on third strike, you can run to first base. So this was the third strike, third out. This team that's on the field has won the game. Well, the kid just starts running to first base, runs all the way around, scores. That team that was celebrating ends up losing the game. And so it's just the pride of this team leads to their downfall. Oedipus and Oedipus Rex. I had a kid that actually wrote about this in my theater class. He compared the stage version versus the movie version. But Oedipus ignores these prophecies, even though it's kind of right in his face where it's going to go wrong, and his whole family ends up being destroyed. Another one besides pride is ambition, and that's just that thirst for power, right? Like at whatever stakes it takes, I'm going to be the top. I'm going to be top dog. Power, fame, y'all know it can corrupt. If y'all have been watching all the stuff on the news about entertainers that get arrested, and it's just their rise to the top and their ambition to be the best or to have it all or to be in charge. That's a big deal. That usually leads to a downfall. If you've seen Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein's scientific ambition, he creates this monster, ignores the nature, the natural order of the world, and it leads to ruin, right? There's a lot of dangerous consequences there. If you've read Macbeth by Shakespeare, his desire to be a general and then he wants to be the king. He goes on, there's this murderous spree, and all of these people end up dead. And then he doesn't realize that it's too late until it's too late. I know it's a lot of listening today, guys. Just hang in there. We're almost at the end. So there's pride, ambition, misplaced trust, or misplaced loyalty. So if other people can convince someone that their beliefs are right and your beliefs are wrong, this is another tragic flaw. It's trusting the bad guy. We see that in stuff like Snow White, when the queen gives the evil apple and she puts her trust in this person and takes a bite of the apple. That now has led to their downfall. Examples, again, Brutus from Julius Caesar. We've talked about Caesar a lot today. He listens to his friend Cassius, who is this senator that nobody likes. I mean, the reason that he listened to Cassius wasn't even smart. So then he murders his best friend for his country by listening, to this dude that he shouldn't have had his trust in the first place. Don Quixote, in the main character of Don Quixote, he dreams of being a knight, and then he doesn't realize that that's a mistake until he's on his deathbed. Indecision. So procrastination, just not able, I know a lot of us have anxiety. I struggle with making decisions. Like that can be really hard. Is it this or is it this? And you want it to be the right thing, and then you end up not making a decision at all. That tragic flaw, it kind of shows that the hero doesn't have trust in themselves, which I think is a really common something that everyone deals with. Hamlet, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, after his uncle kills his dad, he wants this revenge, but then he just kind of overanalyzes everything to the point that he doesn't do anything, and that leads to his downfall. Holden Caulfield, if you've ever read The Catcher in the Rye, he has a really hard time with this idea of growing up and becoming an adult, and so he misses out on living because his indecisiveness has got the best of him. So impetuousness, that's kind of the opposite of indecision. It's someone who they just act immediately. They don't take the time to weigh the options. They just jump headfirst into whatever it is that's the first decision that they come to. They don't think about the consequences of their actions. Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, he falls hard for Juliet and then literally marries her within a couple of days. He's acting on emotion. This isn't logical. This doesn't make sense. It's not what is best for him. And then they both end up dying. Jay Gatsby from The Great Gatsby, he just makes rash decisions just because he falls for this girl named Daisy. This ruins everything as well. The end. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Get back on the main screen. So hopefully this kind of makes sense to you guys. Tragedies tend to follow the same set of circumstances every time, even when the characters are different. I'm sure you can think of some books that you have read where the main character acts too quickly. They don't think through their decisions, or they trust the wrong person, or they refuse to act at all, right? So definitely take that with you as you are going through this lesson. Make sure that you're staying on pace. That's a huge deal. We're in week 7, so we're getting close to the end of the first quarter. If you haven't done a DBA, if you owe work, please, please, please get that turned in. Y'all have my cell phone number. If you need to reach out for any reason, definitely let me know. If you need to do a DBA and you're like, hey, Miss Maynard, your schedule is crazy, none of those times work for me, send me a text. Like I've got somebody I'm meeting at 3:50 today. That's not normally a time that's open on my schedule, but I opened it up for this one. I don't mind doing that. So if it's like, hey, I've got school in the morning, I've got work in the afternoon, I've got this one little bit of space where I could maybe work this in, let me know. Happy to open up some time for you. If you have questions, stick around. Otherwise, I'm going to turn y'all loose. Make sure you're doing your C2 lesson from this morning that y'all talked about. Make sure you're staying on pace. And again, if you have any kind of questions, if there's anything you don't understand, definitely reach out. All right. Otherwise, I will see you on the flip side. Bye, guys. All right. I'm going to end recording. Aw, your kitten's so cute.